The day my brother showed up at my door with a police officer behind him, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stood there in my socks on the cold hardwood floor of my Halifax apartment and listened to him tell the constable that I had forged our father's signature and stolen $70,000 from the family estate. I didn't say a word, not one. And I need you to understand that silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't shock either, even though it felt like both. It was decades of conditioning folded into a single moment. Because when you've spent 30 years being the family's designated problem solver, the one who makes things disappear quietly so no one has to be uncomfortable, your first instinct when accused of something monstrous isn't to defend yourself. It's to wonder, for one horrible second, if maybe you did do something wrong and just don't remember. That's what my brother was counting on. 72 hours earlier, none of this existed. I was sitting in the kitchen of my dad's house in Dartmouth, going through a cardboard box of papers the way I'd been doing every weekend for 3 months. Dad had been diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia the previous spring, and my brother, I'll call him that, just my brother, because using his name still makes my jaw tighten, had been very clear that he didn't have time to help manage the transition. He worked in finance in Toronto. He had a family. He had responsibilities. I was the one still in Nova Scotia, still close by, still available, so naturally it fell to me. I was 31 years old. I worked remotely as a technical writer for a software company. I had a one-bedroom apartment, a cat named after a French poet, and a very thorough understanding of the phrase, "You're the responsible one." I had been the responsible one my entire life. When my brother was 19 and got caught cheating on a university exam, I drove 4 hours to sit with him through the appeals process. When he was 26 and bounced a rent check that came out of our parents' joint account, I transferred the difference without telling anyone because I didn't want Mum to find out and spiral. When he got divorced 5 years ago and stopped answering Dad's calls for 8 months, I was the one driving over twice a week, sitting through the same stories about the 1987 hockey playoffs, making sure Dad ate something that wasn't toast. I didn't call it sacrifice at the time. I called it being a good daughter, a good sister. That's what you do for family. But there's a word for what I actually was, and I didn't learn it until much later. The word is custodian. Not in the legal sense. In the emotional one, I was the person responsible for keeping the peace, smoothing over the damage, absorbing whatever chaos spilled out so that the family image could stay intact. My brother could be absent. My mother could be fragile. My father could be declining. None of it had to be acknowledged out loud because I was there, quietly bleaching the floors. So when my brother called me on a Thursday evening in late October and said he needed a favor, my stomach tightened the same way it always did. But I answered. I always answered. He said he needed me to hold on to some documents for him, specifically a copy of Dad's updated will, the one Dad's lawyer had finalized in September. He said he was worried about them getting lost in the shuffle of estate paperwork, that I was better at organizing this stuff, that he'd feel better knowing I had a copy somewhere safe. I should have asked why he didn't just keep them himself. I should have asked why he was calling at 9 at night, his voice just slightly too careful, too measured, the way it always got when he was managing something. I should have said, "Send me the lawyer's contact, I'll request a copy directly." But the conditioning runs deep. If I just do it, the discomfort goes away. If I ask questions, it becomes a whole thing, and then somehow I'm the difficult one. I said yes. I drove over the next morning, picked up the envelope he'd left in Dad's mailbox, locked it in the fireproof box I kept in my closet for important documents, and didn't think about it again. For about 48 hours. Then my brother called again. This time, his voice was different, tight and performative at the same time, the way it sounds when someone is angry, but also wants witnesses. "There's $70,000 missing from Dad's investment account," he said. The financial advisor flagged it. "There were 2 transfers, both in the last 6 weeks, and your name is on the authorization forms." I laughed, not because it was funny, Because it was so absurd that my brain didn't have another response ready. I don't know if that was impossible, that I didn't have signing authority on that account, that he was confusing something. He said the forms had Dad's signature and mine. He said he'd seen them. He said he was very concerned about what this looked like and that maybe I should start thinking about how to explain myself before things went further. I want a lawyer, I said. He hung up. 20 hours later, there was a police constable at my door. The next part happened the way I imagine it happens for a lot of people who are innocent but don't know how to perform innocence convincingly enough. I was cooperative to the point of passivity. I let them in. I answered questions I shouldn't have answered without counsel. I sat at my own kitchen table while a constable explained that a complaint had been filed, that there were documents with my signature, that my father's financial advisor had flagged unusual activity. I kept thinking, someone will sort this out. Someone will see that this is wrong. The truth is obvious. Surely the truth is obvious. What I didn't know yet was that while I was sitting in my apartment being cooperative, my brother had already been on the phone with our mother. He told her I'd been stealing from Dad, that I'd been manipulating Dad's accounts for months, taking advantage of his cognitive decline, that he'd suspected something for a while but hadn't wanted to believe it. My mother has never been a strong woman in moments of crisis. She loves hard, but she trusts the first voice she hears, especially if that voice belongs to my brother, who she has always believed first, always. When he was a teenager and told her I'd broken curfew, she grounded me without asking. When he said I was being selfish for not moving back home full-time to care for Dad, she repeated it to me almost word for word, genuinely not understanding why I looked like I'd been slapped. So by the time I called her that evening, she already knew. Or thought she knew. She said, "How could you do this to your father?" She said, "He trusted you." She said, "I know you've always resented that we expected more from you, but this." I sat on the floor of my bathroom with the phone in my hand, listening to my mother tell me what kind of person I was, and I couldn't speak. Not because I had nothing to say, because I'd been saying things my entire life and it had never, not once, made a difference when my brother was on the other side of the argument. That night I called the only person I trusted completely, my friend Harriet, who I'd known since we were 8 years old and who had watched my family dynamics from close enough proximity to understand everything I wasn't saying. She drove over with Thai food and sat on my couch and listened. She was the one who said, "You need to call the lawyer yourself, not the family lawyer, your own lawyer." I had a lawyer by 9 a.m. the next day. What followed was 2 weeks that I don't have clean memories of, just fragments. The smell of a coffee I kept forgetting to drink. The way Halifax light looks in November, flat and grey and honest. The constable's card sitting on my kitchen counter next to my grocery list. My lawyer, a methodical woman in her 50s, who I liked immediately because she asked twice to make sure she'd heard me correctly before she reacted to anything, moved quickly. She contacted Dad's financial advisor directly. She requested the original authorization documents, not copies. She asked for the metadata on the digital files. What she found was something I hadn't expected, even knowing my brother was behind it. The signatures on the transfer documents had been created by layering. My signature, pulled from a real document I had actually signed, a property assessment consent form from 2 years earlier, had been digitally placed onto fabricated transfer authorizations. It was sophisticated enough to pass a casual review but not a forensic one. The metadata on the files showed they'd been created on a laptop registered to my brother. There was more. The financial advisor, once the forensics team began asking pointed questions, admitted that he had been approached by my brother 6 weeks earlier. My brother had suggested that I was potentially manipulating Dad's accounts and asked the advisor to flag any transactions involving my name. The advisor, to his credit, had been uncomfortable with this from the start and had notes. He'd filed the concern report only because my brother had implied he had a legal obligation to do so if he suspected elder financial abuse. He hadn't actually verified anything himself. My brother had built the stage, lit the lights, and handed everyone their scripts before I even knew there was a performance happening. Here's what I didn't know during any of this. I didn't know that Dad had updated his will in September and that the new version left the family property in Dartmouth, a house worth substantially more than it had been because of how the market had moved, to me and my brother equally, with an additional clause giving me primary decision-making authority over Dad's care while he was living. The previous version had left everything split equally but given my brother authority over finances. My brother had found out about the change because he had a relationship with the family lawyer's assistant that I didn't know about. He'd seen the new will, and he'd decided that framing me for financial abuse was cleaner than contesting it. The documents he'd asked me to hold, the envelope in my fireproof box, turned out to be deliberately outdated versions of estate papers. If things had gone according to his plan, I would have been arrested, stripped of any trustee or decision-making role, and the family property would have defaulted back to a structure that suited him. He had driven up from Toronto specifically to set this in motion. He'd left the envelope in Dad's mailbox knowing I would take it, knowing it would look like I'd been given access to documents I shouldn't have, knowing it gave him a thread to pull. The forensic accountant my lawyer brought in found no actual missing money. The $70,000 my brother had cited was a complete fabrication. The account had never had that transaction. There was no transfer. He had told the financial advisor, told our mother, told the constable about money that had never moved, and no one had verified it before showing up at my door. I was not charged. The complaint was withdrawn. The RCMP referred the matter for further investigation, and eventually my brother was the one with a file opened against him for fraud and filing a false report. He called me once after. He said I had overreacted. He said he'd been worried about Dad's accounts and had maybe jumped to conclusions. He used the word miscommunication 3 times in 4 sentences. I let him finish. Then I told him I had a letter from my lawyer that I'd be sending him by registered mail, and that he should read it carefully before responding, and I hung up. My mother took longer. She isn't a villain, which is in some ways harder to deal with than if she were. She's a woman who was never taught to interrogate the version of events that came to her first, especially when it came to me versus my brother. She cried when she found out what had actually happened. She apologized, and she meant it. She said she didn't understand how she kept doing this. I told her I didn't have an answer for that. I told her I needed time. I gave myself permission to let time be indefinite. Dad doesn't fully understand what happened. On a good day, he knows something went wrong with my brother. On a harder day, he asks when my brother is coming to visit, and I tell him soon, and I sit with the specific grief of watching someone you love be confused about the people who were supposed to love them back. Isabella. No, wait. That's not her name. I don't have an Isabella. I have my father, and I have the house in Dartmouth, and I have the authority I was given in that will to make decisions that keep him comfortable and safe. I have Harriet, who drove over with Thai food and told me to call a lawyer. And I have something I didn't have before any of this, which is a very clear and complete understanding of what I was trained to be, and a very deliberate choice to stop being it. I am not the designated problem solver anymore. I am not the one who quietly bleaches the floor so the family can pretend there was never any blood. I tried that for 31 years, and it ended with a constable at my door and my mother's voice on the phone asking how I could do this to my father. What I know now is that the fixers of the world aren't rewarded for their fixing. They're just given more things to fix until one day someone hands them the blame for a mess they didn't make. I know this because it happened to me, and I know what comes after it because I chose something different. I kept the house in Dartmouth. I helped my father live in it with dignity. I built a life where the chaos of other people is not my responsibility to absorb. Justice wasn't the fraud investigation. Justice wasn't my brother getting a file opened against him. Justice was the first morning I woke up and realized I had not spent the previous night rehearsing conversations in my head, trying to figure out how to fix something I hadn't broken. That quiet was the real verdict. And it was the first thing in years that felt entirely mine. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being the person everyone relies on to hold things together, not the tide you feel after a long day at work. Something deeper than that. The tire that lives in your shoulders and your jaw and the part of your brain that never fully shuts off because you're always anticipating the next thing that needs to be managed. I lived inside that exhaustion for most of my adult life, and I thought it was just who I was. I thought it was what being a good person looked like. What I've come to understand, slowly and not without grief, is that goodness and self-erasure are not the same thing. I was good, genuinely, in the way I showed up for my father, in the way I drove over twice a week and sat through the same stories and made sure he ate something real. That was love, and I don't regret any of it. But the part where I absorbed my brother's chaos without question, where I moved money to cover his mistakes, where I drove hours to save him from consequences that were entirely his own, that wasn't goodness. That was fear dressed up as loyalty. The choices we make in those quiet moments when no one is watching, that's where character actually lives. My brother made a choice too. He saw a situation that didn't suit him, and he built a lie carefully enough to almost hold. He didn't get there by accident. He got there because for 30 years, every time he needed someone to clean up his mess, I was there. I taught him, without meaning to, that the consequences of his actions would always be softened by mine. What saved me wasn't luck. It was Harriet showing up with food and a clear head when I'd lost both. It was the forensic accountant who knew what to look for in metadata. It was my own lawyer asking me twice whether she'd heard me correctly, not to doubt me, but to make sure she understood exactly what she was walking into. Intelligence, real practical intelligence, isn't just about being smart. It's about knowing which questions to ask and not stopping until you have honest answers. I had to learn to apply that same rigor to my own life, to stop accepting the narrative I'd been handed and actually look at the evidence. And the evidence, once I looked at it clearly, was that I had been capable all along, not of being saved, of acting, of calling a lawyer at 9 in the morning, of sending the registered letter, of saying I need time and meaning it. That capacity for follow-through, for not collapsing when the pressure is highest, that's not something you either have or you don't. It's something you build by doing the hard thing once, and then again, until it starts to feel less impossible. My father is still in the Dartmouth house. On good days, he knows the difference between what happened and what my brother told him happened. On harder days, he doesn't, and I sit with that without trying to fix it. Because some things aren't mine to fix. What is mine is the quiet. The mornings I wake up without a rehearsed conversation already running in my head. The evenings I close my laptop and the work is just done, not festering into something I'll have to manage tomorrow. That quiet cost me something. I won't pretend otherwise, but I earned it honestly, which is more than I can say for the envelope my brother left in my father's mailbox. I hope, genuinely, that he finds a way to become someone who doesn't need to build traps for the people who trusted him. Not for my sake anymore. For his own.